Hello, everyone. This is the 259th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles on the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back Mr. Runar Nordvik, head of media at Norwegian Club FK Haugesund and a former football journalist, as we discuss Norway in the 1994 World Cup. Welcome back, Runar.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's go back in time. What was the state of Norwegian football at the onset of the year 1994 as their nation were about to participate in the World Cup in USA?
I think there's only one proper word to describe the emotions back home in Norway at the time, and that was complete, actually, two words, complete euphoria. Everyone was speaking about the Norwegian national team and the forthcoming participation in the World Cup because until then, it seemed more or less like a dream that never would come true. So no one really believed that you would see the Norwegian national team on a big stage. But then this weird professor arrived as the new national team coach and he turned everything upside down. He didn't only turn Norwegian football upside down, he turned more or less the entire global football upside down by doing what he did with the Norwegian national team. So people were over the moon, and not a day passed by from we had qualified the year before until the tournament started without this being one of the main subjects in the medias and every TV and everywhere. You would find something World Cup related all over the place. Every channel, every newspaper, all over the place. Boards, people were talking about this 24/7.
So let's discuss Egil Olsen. This has been discussed before in our interviews, but for anyone unfamiliar, can you discuss his trajectory up to this point?
Well, he was considered the nutty professor because, well, to a large extent due to his personality, but first and foremost because he had a very analytical approach to football, which he managed to turn into results because the Norwegian national team always pulled the shortest straw whenever there was important matches to be played. But with Egil Olsen arriving after the World Cup in 1990, I think he arrived late that season in 1990 or
Yeah,
something like that.
October 1990, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, and from the very first game on, he managed to convince people that everything was possible. So, and first and foremost, he managed to convince his players that everything was possible. And he got results. We beat Cameroon, I think, 6-1 in his first game. And ever since, we hardly lost a game up until the qualifiers. And we would also go into the qualifiers and play throughout the qualifiers under Egil Olsen in the same way, and we managed to get results everywhere we went. It didn't matter who we faced, we managed to secure the points needed. So his trajectory had been up until this time a straight upward line, more or less.
Would you compare the impact of Olsen similar to that of Sepp Piontek to Denmark's fortunes just a decade earlier?
Yeah, I think it's a quite good comparison. There's one huge difference though, and that is Sepp Piontek. He took charge of a set of players which was actually really good. Denmark had been underperforming for many years despite the quality of their players. They had a very strong setup of players playing in some of the best clubs in Europe, but they had a cultural problem challenge, which Sepp Piontek managed to deal with and turn it into a team. So they became a formidable force. Whereas Egil Olsen, he didn't have that kind of players. He had a one or two players that you could say was at a very decent international level. But first and foremost, he managed to turn rather modest players into a formidable force as a team. It was
As a team, they were bigger than some of their parts, basically.
definitely, definitely. So, but I think when you look back at both Piontek's reign and Drillo Olsen's reign, you could say that there were strong similarities, how they managed to turn things around, but there were also some differences.
And can you discuss the general tactics of Egil Olsen?
The main reason why he started to get results is mainly because he had this extremely direct approach to the game, the way of playing the game. He had absolutely no interest in just holding the ball within the team. He wanted the ball to play upwards as soon as possible. Straight away after winning the ball, you were supposed to deliver it upwards in the field. He more or less forbid the sideways passing and that kind of stuff. So we had this extreme direct approach to the game, which was quite similar to British football back in the 50s, 60s. So I think most people would consider his kind of football as very simple and not very sophisticated, but he didn't mind. He considered that a huge advantage that the rest of the world was too slow to react to this kind of approach because he knew that this was the way to get results. And he introduced what we in Norway call the flow pass. It was probably his most efficient weapon as part of his tactics. He had a very good left-footed fullback called Stig Inge Bjørneby, who used to play for Liverpool. He had tremendous passes, so he managed to make these crosses from our own defensive zone on the left fullback over to a very tall center forward called Jostein Flo, who was magnificent in the air. The simple tactics was that Bjørneby was supposed to hit the ball as long and precise as he could to find Jostein Flo within the opponent's 16 meters box. And Flo was supposed to win every duel, and then they were supposed to create chances from that. And it worked. And it worked because Egil Dale Olsen knew it would work because that's how he had played at club level in Norway beforehand. So this was probably his signature move, sort of. It was not very well appreciated by football fans elsewhere, but in Norway, nobody cared because finally we got results.
And it was generally a 4-5-1 formation.
Yes, yes.
Again, we touch upon this on our previous interview about the historic 1993 World Cup qualifier between England and Norway. But can you summarize Norway's qualification phase in a group with the Netherlands, England, Poland, Turkey, and San Marino?
Yeah, if you look at that group and the teams we faced, I think it's fair to say that this was the group of death. It was a terrible group in terms of the opponents because there were quality teams from every seeding group except for San Marino, but Turkey, Poland, Netherlands, and England in one group. I think everyone more or less expected Norway to drop out on the qualification to the tournament simply due to the quality of the opponents. But Egil Olsen, as I said, he managed to convince his players that this was indeed possible, and that was the most important factor. So I remember we played,
San
uh,
Marino,
yeah, San Marino. We beat
the
them
10
10,
10
which
0,
was
yeah.
yeah, we were off to a very good start, of course, but that was to be expected. The first main challenge was playing the Dutch at home, and we managed to win 2-1. At that time, after that game, I think everyone sensed that this was indeed possible. And Egil Dale Olsen became famous due to his speech in the dressing room prior to the game, because the last thing he said to his players before walking out, and they were supposed to face Ruud Gullit, Ronald Koeman, the biggest stars in Europe playing for the Dutch team, who was easily one of the best teams in the world at the time. And the last thing he said to his players, remember not to underestimate them now, guys, which was an insane thing to say, but it was sort of illustration of the way he had managed to change the mindset of his players, because his players up until at this point, they believed everything. They believed that they would win every game they played because it had worked for the team for the last 2 or 3 seasons with Egil Olsen in charge. So that quote is still cited quite often in Norway. Remember not to underestimate them. And then you were out against Gullit and the biggest players in Europe, and we managed to beat them 2-1. And everything from there went off, and it went off from there. And then we went to England, and we were dead lucky, should be said. We were absolutely murdered in terms of chances created, but I'm not really sure if he was the team captain or Kjetil Rekdal. He came up with one of the best goals in Norwegian
Yes.
football, this a shot from distance, which made it 1-1, and we managed to secure a draw at Wembley, which of course was a huge result. Well, from then, everything was possible. We had just beaten the Dutch. We had managed a draw away to England. And in succession, we just managed to get results. We managed to beat, we beat, that was towards the end of the qualification. We beat Turkey at home, and we beat Poland at home. And probably more importantly, we managed to secure a draw against the Dutch 0-0 in Rotterdam, I remember. And yet again, we were absolutely murdered by the Dutch in terms, I think they created 20 chances, and we hardly managed to, well, get out of our own half during the game. But we managed to secure a 0-0 draw. And well, yeah, well, we had the combination of quality and luck, and everything just went our way because the other results as well was in our favor. I remember the Norwegian people more or less started celebrating qualifying for the World Cup tournament even before we had played the last two important matches. We were supposed to play Poland away. And prior to that, there were mass celebrations in Norway. People were out in the streets in the capital, and the players went by in an open wagon sort of parade. And it was completely insane looking back to start celebrating qualification for a tournament when you still had the important matches to be played. But I think more or less everyone after we also beat England at home, that should be said. We would go on to beat England at home. So once you sort of manage to get results in every game against the Dutch and English team, people were more or less convinced that there was nothing going to stop us now. But it was an extremely hard group to get out of. So looking back, it makes the effort and the even bigger when you see what we were up against at the time.
Norway players were also very much in demand in the English Premier League. Can you discuss this phenomenon?
Yeah, I think there's one simple answer to that. We had a few players playing in England in the late 80s, the start of the 90s. Not very many, but there was first and foremost a huge attraction for Norwegian players to play in England. So it was more or less the biggest dream of every player. And I know that the English, and should be said that at this time, the English Premier League, it wasn't as competitive probably as it is today. Today, you just gather the biggest stars and you pay the highest wages. English football was much more like the other leagues at the time. There was just as much money in Germany and Italy and France and Spain. But the Norwegian players who had been in England had performed very well simply because they were 100% professionals. So when English team signed a Norwegian player, they knew they would get a 100% professional player who would always do the job. Wasn't necessarily spectacular or extraordinary quality of players, but they were true professionals. So that was the main attraction for English clubs at the time. So there was a point when there were more than 20, 25 Norwegian players playing in the top flight in England. A lot of them would never appear for the national team, but they will still be signed by very good clubs in England. And at some point, there were four Norwegians in Liverpool and there were four Norwegians in Manchester United. And well, it was partly because I think Norwegian football had gained a lot of respect during the qualification to this tournament, as well as the other results that the team had gathered. But in general terms, it was mainly due to Norwegian players adapting to the English football scene very well from day one. Didn't need any time to adjust, or they could just show up and perform from day one, which was probably the main reason why Norwegian players was attractive.
This was the nation's first World Cup appearance since 1938 in the pre-war era. So, culturally, what was the build up and the anticipation like as a whole generation had never experienced the World Cup?
Well, it was, as I already mentioned, it was more or less insane. This was the main subject for months, well, more or less a year, ever since we had qualified back in September 93. This was all over the place. And there was, you could read about it and watch it. Football was everywhere, and the forthcoming World Cup was everywhere. And I still remember prior to the World Cup, Egil Drillo Olsen, he had named a squad of 19 players. So there were three names remaining, which he wanted to choose much closer to the tournament. So I think 3 or 4 months prior to the tournament, there was a direct transmission on every TV channel, radio channel, where he was supposed to name the three remaining players. And even everyone knew that these three players, they would never play a single minute. But the entire country just stopped to get this extra broadcast. I remember standing in a shop and everyone else in the shop, they were just standing like they froze to because the announcement would come over the intercom in the shop. So they announced it directly, and everyone was just standing there listening to who are the three remaining players. And either you supported the names or you started discussing, no, 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 that's the wrong players. But everyone knew that these three guys, they would never play any major part. But it was just quite a good illustration of the sense and the emotions at the time. Everything was related to the forthcoming World Cup. So it was major issue in everyday life for, well, even people who wasn't interested in football just took part. And it was impossible to avoid the discussions and the news and everything was related to the forthcoming World Cup. And I think that if you go back in time and check the major newspapers' front pages for the last 6 months prior to the tournament, you will probably find something World Cup related on the front page in 90% of every edition that was released.
And do you remember if there was an official song like most nations do for the World Cup?
Absolutely. Yes. That even created was part of the hype or what you supposed to call it. It was turned into a major hit and it's still played to these days. There's been written another different songs, handful of songs afterwards for other occasions or tournaments, but nothing compares to Alt for Norge, which was written for this tournament, and it's still probably the most famous. It's definitely the most famous football song, but it's also one of the most well-known Norwegian songs of all times. It just made sense, just was part of the euphoria at the time. So everyone walked around singing it. And so, yes, there was definitely a song.
As far as expectations, I imagine it was mainly mostly satisfaction in being present in the main event at this point.
Yes and no. I think the qualification had showed us that we didn't have to fear anyone. So I think people went into the tournament thinking that we were supposed to go quite far. As I remember it, I had quite a strong belief that this team, not due to the quality of the single players, but simply due to how they worked as a team and how they had turned more or less into this unbeatable force over so many years. They could reach the semifinals if they had a decent draw in the second round and quarterfinals. And so I think there was quite, I remember it as a team that went to the United States with quite a huge set of expectations from Norwegian fans.
Rune Bratseth had already announced that he would retire at the conclusion of the World Cup. Was this regarded as a well deserved send off for his career?
Yeah, it was. Rune Bratseth was one of the very few players at very, very good international level. He had been a major central defender in Germany and for the national team for 6, 7 years. He actually was a late bloomer, so he didn't turn into the kind of player he ended up being till in the second half of his 20s. The latter half of his 20s, I think he was 33, 34 at the time. And this was considered the perfect way to call it a day on what at the time was an extraordinary career in terms of Norwegian football because we weren't used to having that kind of players winning trophies in the best leagues and even winning trophies in Europe. And he did a lot of stuff and he's considered still as one of the best defenders ever in German football, for instance. And I think everyone in Germany who's somewhat interested in football still remember Der Elch, the Norwegian moose, which he was nicknamed. So he ended it on a high note by playing this tournament, which was historical in Norwegian terms.
Now, looking at the preparation friendly matches ahead of the World Cup, Norway earned generally positive results. What was the takeaway from these matches back home?
I think they just confirmed what everyone knew or expected, that it was a team that was competitive, playing more or less everyone. If anything, the friendlies prior to the tournament was just able to convince people that this team was expected to do great when the actual tournament started. Well, it was just a confirmation on what people had seen for the last 3 or 4 years already under Egil Olsen, that they just went on like this machine-wise kind of producing results. Not necessarily very spectacular football. As I already mentioned, it was considered very simple and cynical and but it worked out very efficient as a very efficient way of getting results.
Yes, and some of the results included a win at Cardiff against Wales 3-1, scoreless ties against Portugal at home and away at Wembley against England. They defeated Denmark at Oslo. A few days later, they lost to Sweden. But yeah, overall, fairly good results.
Yeah, as for the actual game against Sweden, I remember Sweden would go on to the tournament as well in the United States. And I remember Swedish head coach Tommy Svensson at the time, he announced prior to the game that he was the first head coach that had figured out how to beat Norway. And everyone was thinking, haha, you have absolutely no clue. You will find out when you face them. But he actually managed to beat Norway as the more or less first head coach for well, 3, 4 years. He as well knew what he was doing, and Sweden would go on to make a great tournament in the United States.
Norway were to be in a group with Italy, Mexico, and Republic of Ireland. What was the consensus on Norway's chances, bearing in mind they would be playing under the scorching heat of America?
I think people expected Norway to go through together with Italy, and that we were supposed to leave both Ireland and Mexico away. This wasn't necessarily based on any rationality or devaluation of those two teams, but it was first and foremost due to the sense that it took a major effort to be able to defeat this Norwegian team. And those teams were among those kind of teams that we had for lunch for 3 years. So looking back, you can say that it was a very, very strong group, and the results as well proves it afterwards. But expectation was that this is a group that the Norwegian team are supposed to get through from.
For the American soccer magazine Soccer America, Mike Voitala, the journalist, had interviewed Egil Olsen, and he asked him if Norway will entertain. And his reply was no, but we will win.
Yeah,
And he said that he was against dribbling and cited that as proof most goals are scored after one or two passes. And 13 of Norway's 25 goals had been from set plays.
yeah.
So let's look at the final 22 selected for the World Cup. We should mention ahead that Tore Pedersen was injured in March, and that ruled him out of the World Cup. So for the final 22, we have the goalkeepers at number one, Erik Thorsvedt of Tottenham, number 12, Frode Grodas of Lillestrøm, and number 13, Ola Bayrais of Rosenborg. For defenders, at number 2, Gunnar Hall, Oldham Athletic, number 3, Erland Johnson of Chelsea, number 4, Rune Bratseth of Werder Bremen, number 5, Stig Ing Bjørneby of Liverpool, number 14, Roger Nilsson of Sheffield United, number 17, Dan Eggen of Brøndby, number 18, Alf Ing Haaland of Nottingham Forest, number 20, Henning Berg of Blackburn Rovers. Midfielders at number 6, we have Jostein Flo of Sheffield United. Number 7, Erik Mikland of Start. Number 8, Øyvind Leonhardsen of Rosenborg. Number 10, Kjetil Rekdal of Liers in Belgium. Number 11, Jan Iver Jakobsen Mini from Young Boys Bern in Switzerland. Number 15, Karl Petter Loken of Rosenborg. Number 19, Roar Strand of Rosenborg. And number 22, Lars Bohinen of Nottingham Forest. We have 3 strikers. Number 9, Jan Ag Fjørtoft of Swindon Town. Number 16, Goran Sorloth of Bursaspor in Turkey. And number 21, Sigurd Rushfeldt of Tromsø. So, where were you in life at this point, and how did you experience this World Cup?
Well, I was a student back then, and like everyone else, extremely excited about the forthcoming tournament because I was also among those who was convinced that you would never see Norway take part in a major tournament, either the European Championships or the World Championships. It wasn't supposed to happen, sort of. So when we finally got this team, and as you were name dropping these players, I think we could say more or less that every one of those 22 players today are considered more or less, with a few exceptions, legends in Norwegian football, and all of them have made careers afterwards in either continuing as coaches or working for media. So I got sort of goosebumps when you mentioned these kind of old old players. And as already mentioned, it wasn't necessarily the highest quality player by player compared to what other teams was able to gather, but it's an interesting fact that 2 of these players, which was so vital and important for this team, Erik Mykland from Start and Lars Bohinen, especially those 2, they were actually very, very different players compared to the way the Norwegian team would actually play, because they were extremely technically skillful. They weren't strong, they weren't physical, but they were also extremely loyal to this system, despite it meaning that they played a kind of football that wasn't actually their kind of football. but they was 100% dedicated. And there was a word of saying at the time that as a midfielder on the Norwegian team, you would never touch the ball, which was somewhat true because it would be knocked over them whenever the Norwegian team had the opportunity. So these kind of players, they were 100% committed to a style of play that they knew would get result, but they didn't play at club level or wasn't actually the kind of football that would make them shine. Because those two were standout players in terms of technical ability and that kind of stuff. So it's very interesting when you name drop these players now and you can look back and see how they adapted to this system because both of them turned into very influential key players for Egil Olsen.
Yes, and I just noticed I called out Jan Ivar Jakobsen as a player for Young Boys Bern, but I also have him listed as a player for Liers in Belgium. So I will have to verify that. And of
No,
course,
he went on loan. I think he was playing for Young Boys Bern for a couple of seasons, and then he moved to Germany to play for Duisburg in Germany. But he didn't. I think he hardly played a game for Duisburg, who was in the first Bundesliga at the time. So he went on loan to Lierse in Belgium, where he was getting play time prior to the World Cup.
let's look at Norway's first match in the World Cup. So on June 19th, they face off against Mexico at Washington, D.C. at RFK Memorial Stadium. So for this match, Norway wearing white kits, we have the following lineup: Thorsvedt, Berg, Bratseth, captain of the team, Bjørnaby, Haaland, Bohinen, Flo, Mikland. He replaced by Rekdal in the 79th minute. Very important substitution. Leonardsen, Jakobsen, and he'd replaced by Hall in the 46th minute and Fjørtoft. So Norway had actually goal disallowed in the 29th minute, but they would have to wait until the last 5 minutes to score the winner. When in the middle, slightly towards the right, Fjørtoft was impeded by Suarez, and Rekdal picked up the loose ball and scored Norway's winner. Norway won 1-0, and in the last minute, Mexican striker Zage, his header also hit the post. It was then cleared by Henningberg on the line.
Yeah,
So it could have been a tight match. But nevertheless, Norway won. And this was actually Norway's first ever win in the World Cup history.
yeah.
So, yeah.
I recommend everyone to just check on YouTube or the actual situation where Sage managed to hit the crossbar. And that is one of the most insane situations in football ever. How that didn't end up as an equalizer, it's beyond amazing. It's totally insane that we managed to keep a clean sheet when you see that situation. I recommend everyone to just check it out if you don't remember it.
The next match was on June 23rd at East Rutherford, New Jersey, at the Giant Stadium against Italy of Arrigo Sacchi. And this is the Italy of Roberto Baggio, Baresi, Maldini, all the stars. So for this match, we have the following lineup: Thorsvedt, Berg, Bratseth, captain of the team, Bjørnaby, Haaland, Bohinen, Mikland. He'd replaced by Rekdal in the 81st minute, Flo, Leonardsen, Fjørtoft, Rushfeldt, and he was replaced by Jakobsen in the 46th minute. Now, this is the famous match where Gianluca Pagliuca, the Italian goalkeeper, is sent off in the 21st minute, and who gets replaced? A certain Roberto Baggio with the substitute goalkeeper Luca Marchegiani. But Italy, with one less man, would end up winning this match. In the 69th minute, Giuseppe Signori's free kick from the left side was headed in by Dino Baggio, and Italy would win this match. We should point out that when Sigurd Rushfeldt was replaced in the 46th minute, Jakobsen switched to the left and Flo switched to the right as a tactical formation. And as far as Rushfeldt, this was actually his second ever cap for Norway. In fact, he earned his first cap just days before in that friendly against Sweden on June
Yeah.
5th. So, yeah, surprising start for Rushfeldt. And in fact, also Norway had a goal disallowed in the 82nd minute, but Norway lost and they failed to capitalize on their one man advantage. I think if that held on to tie, they probably would have been in a very strong position to advance.
I remember it as a very disappointing performance. I think it was a quite a well-deserved win by Italy, actually, because after the sending off, the Norwegian team wasn't able to. Well, you were up against the best defensive line in the world at the time. Look at those names. But they hardly was able to create any chances against this Italian team. So you just knew that at some point you would get penalized by this team. So I remember it as a quite well-deserved win for Italy, which at the time they would go into turn into our probably major nemesis in the years to come until recently when we have started beating them convincingly. But yeah, I remember everyone was very, very disappointed by the performance and the result. And I remember also Egil Olsen saying afterwards that it would probably have been better to play 11 against 11 because when Italy are a player down, they even turn even more cynical than they are known for or was at the time.
So, the last match in the group is on June 28th, again at East Rutherford, New Jersey, at the Giant Stadium against the Republic of Ireland. Now, the Republic of Ireland manager Jackie Charlton was actually not present on the bench due to ban for disturbances in the previous match against Mexico. So, for this match, Norway wearing red and dark sleeves, we have the following lineup: Thorsvedt, Hall, he replaced by Jakobsen in the 34th minute. Erland Johnson, Bratseth, captain of a team. This was his 60th and final cap and final match ever for Bratseth. His first cap had been in 1986. Then you have Henning Berg, Mikland, Bjørnaby, Leonardsen. He'd replaced by Bohinen in the 68th minute. Rekdal, Flo, and Sorloth. And for Sorloth, this was also his 55th and final cap for Norway. His first cap had been in 1985. So this match ended as a dismal scoreless tie. Norway were the only team to be eliminated with 4 points. Had they scored one more goal, they would have advanced. But from this group, Italy, Mexico, and Republic of Ireland advanced. It was a very tight group, but Norway were eliminated. This match against Ireland is considered as one of the worst matches of this World Cup. Was it a case of two teams, both of them very difficult to beat, facing off, and naturally it was never going to be an entertaining match?
No, I think you're spot on. No one predicted the high score line, first and foremost, and no one expected a game where the teams would create many chances. So everyone knew that this was going to be tight. I think people, even despite the lackluster effort against Italy a few days earlier, people expected Norway to beat Ireland, but we also knew that they were sort of good at the same stuff that made our team so hard to beat. I think we got the kind of match that was to be expected. And I remember it as 90 minutes without hardly any major chances created. And Norway didn't create, well, probably had only one or two goal scoring opportunities. So it was yet another poor performance by the Norwegian team. Well, afterwards, Egil Olsen would receive some criticism due to his lack of effort to get the decisive goal, I remember.
Do you remember how the World Cup was followed back home?
Yeah, it was, well, as this was played in the United States, all matches was played late in the night or even in the middle of the night. So I remember especially the opening game, which was, I think it started at 2 o'clock in nighttime in Norway. So everyone watched it on television during night, and everyone stayed up to watch. And I still remember the opening game where Rekdal scored the decisive goal just a few minutes from the end. You could hear from more or less every house or apartment people cheering in the middle of the night. It was a very special occasion. It was something you hadn't experienced in Norway before, but you knew that in every apartment, every house, people were watching the game. So that's how we followed it. And this was prior to the internet. So I also remember the waiting for newspapers the next day before you could actually read something about the matches. There was nothing. It was news about the matches and the tournament. You had to wait for next day's newspaper, except for, of course, something on the TV, but it was a completely different situation compared to today where you get information in real time.
In the aftermath, you mentioned Egil Olsen's decisions were somewhat questioned in the media. Nevertheless, was there also a belief that being at the World Cup was also a success in itself, at least at this point?
Yes, I think most people were very pleased that we took part, of course, most definitely, absolutely. But I think also people were quite disappointed about how we had performed. I don't think we actually managed to get on the level that people wanted or expected in either of those three matches. So there was a major disappointment when the Norwegian team was knocked out by how we had performed. And I also remember when the team came back and we were supposed to start on another qualifier for the Euros, that people were discussing whether it was time to sort of change the way of football into a more, well, adjust our football to the way it was played by other teams, by, well, a much more possession-oriented football and more kind of entertaining football. But Egil Olsen stood firm on no, that's not the way to go into the future. We're going to continue with this kind of football. This is what's proven to get results, and this is. I would say the tournament was disappointing, and it was a major bump in the road towards defining the Norwegian team. I remember Egil received quite some criticism due to the way we had played and the way we hadn't managed to. It didn't look like we actually went for it against Ireland the way we should if we really, really wanted to go through. So being knocked out was a disappointment. The way we had performed was a disappointment. But I think the excitement around surrounding this team was back when the Euro qualification would start a few months later.
Were there any individual players who benefited from this World Cup, or was it still, like we said earlier, a group effort?
This was first and foremost a group effort. And as you mentioned, all of these players more or less were already placed at very good clubs in England. So I don't think not that many of those players managed to secure better moves afterwards. Because I think also the rest of the world also knew that this was first and foremost a team effort. So, and it was also sort of disappointing the way the Norwegian team had approached the tournament, the actual tournament. So it didn't set off any of those careers in particular way. The two major players, Rune Bratseth and our goalkeeper Erik Florstvedt, were soon to be retired anyway. So, well, it just went on as business as usual once they came back from the tournament.
According to the FIFA technical report after the World Cup, Norway gave opponents too much room, even though they had 5 men in midfield. Strikers Fjørtoft and Soroth in the last match were always isolated and outnumbered up front. The two central defenders stood out. In general, the defense was considered the main strength of the team. There was a lack of imagination up front, and of course, like we mentioned, the attack was ineffectual. Bratseth and Thorsvedt stood out per the report. Do you remember what was the reception of the team upon their return home?
I think they went somewhat under the radar. I think they just went home in silence and people just went on looking for the forthcoming qualifiers for the Euros. And there was some discussions, of course, and not only in terms of how the way the team had played, and but also in terms of how the team had prepared for the tournament. Due to this was should be mentioned that during this World Cup they were playing all their matches in an extreme heat wave. So
Midday sun, yeah.
yeah, it was extremely hot during those matches, which is really not an excuse, for instance, against the Irish because they suffered as well. But of course, it probably benefited the Mexicans and the Italian team. But as part of the preparations, they tried to adjust to the climate by training in sort of black plastic bags to get the feeling of the forthcoming heat wave that was expected to take part in to be present at the matches. So they were somewhat ridiculed for those kind of preparations, I remember. And people were starting to dig into things that could make things better. It wasn't sort of a destructive way of analyzing things, but it was an proper effort to develop things to make things better in the future. And well, they would go on to, I would say, develop as a team after this experience.
Did Norway now have a different status whereby they were favored to qualify from a Euro or a World Cup qualifying group?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. We lost out on the Euros in 1996 by a very late goal against the Czech, if I remember correctly. So we actually didn't manage to get to those Euros despite us being expected to do so. But then we came back and performed very well for the qualifications for the World Cup in 1998. That was also expected by everyone because throughout this period, we had continued on the road of winning matches and getting results from important matches. And so, more or less throughout the entire reign of Egil Drillo Olsen in his first period as a national team coach, the team was on its way upwards. And it should also be mentioned that shortly after this World Cup tournament, the team would get a handful of names that people would still remember, like Solskjær and Ronny Johnsen, and a lot of players that wasn't taking major part in 94, but would become, of course, extremely important players in the next forthcoming years.
In closing, what is the legacy of this World Cup adventure in Norway's football history and culture?
It's very fondly remembered despite the actual effort and performance by the Norwegian team because it was such an important tournament, such an important issue in everyday life for such a long period of time. So everyone remembers this period in life. So it looked back upon with great fondness by everyone, even despite the results. And later on, and even today, when you see the Norwegian team today, I don't think you really can compare to towards back then in terms of how people, the excitement of taking part in a tournament. Even now, when we are back, heading back to the United States with a very, very nice and a good team, which is a very different team because now we have a lot of very, very strong individual players, major players playing for the best clubs in the world. But the euphoria back then, I don't think you can ever expect to get that back. So this tournament back in 94, as it was our first major tournament since 38, well, it's very, very fondly looked upon.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview and hope to continue these discussions on Norway football history. Thank you once again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.